I'll be chairing today's Forum Roundtable, and I'd like to welcome you all, and special guest Vicky Ward. It's not the first time we've had a government representative at one of our forums, and that's terrific. Before I start, I'd like to read a short message from our President, Nick Lowe, who can't attend. He's got a wife who's not in good shape, she's not well, and he says, "I can't be here today. At present, my domestic duties must prevail over everything else. But I want to thank you all for being here. Every forum of this kind matters. Everyone here can help us as a society look ahead and prepare for what is coming, the climate catastrophe. In the interest of brevity, I just want to throw one idea into the discussion. I believe that the elephant in the room is lifestyle change. We cannot get to net zero without changing how we live. None of us here in Australia or anywhere else represented at Glasgow want to confront the inconvenient truth. International reputations focus on national plans and outcomes and on production, green hydrogen, wind and solar energy, electric cars, but there's an additional factor, an individual factor, on the consumption side. Thomas Piketty, in his recent book Capital and Ideology, argues that rising inequality and global heating are twin closely connected global challenges. Piketty points out that carbon emissions are strongly concentrated among a small group of people with high incomes and large fortunes living in the wealthiest countries in the world. He argues the magnitude of the lifestyle changes required to cope with the climate crisis is so great that it's hard to imagine how to make those changes socially and politically acceptable without establishing stringent and verifiable norms of justice. There will be in time a global price for producing and burning fossil fuels. Australia cannot escape that. But how will that price be shared out nationally and globally? There is so much to discuss in this forum about the future of our cities, our future mobility, the transport systems that facilitate mobility, and our urban and rural lifestyles, all crucially important practical matters. But let's not forget how those practical matters are subject to the ideologies, the norms of justice that govern our society and, in the end, influence the outcomes that can be achieved. Once again, I thank you all for coming to this forum, and I know you can look forward to some vibrant discussion. Nick Lowe, President, Transport for Melbourne. This forum will build on the forum we held last year, the future we must plan for, a future that will be dominated by environmental change, including climate change. As Professors David Caroli and Will Stephan, who were speakers last year, said, there is an imperative to reduce emissions now, and David advised that to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, the limit accepted by the G7 group of nations to avoid dangerous climate change, it was necessary to reduce emissions not by 100%, but by 125%, not by 2050, but by 2030. Will Stephan has since advised that if we miss the 2030 deadline by only 5 years, the best we can hope for is to limit global warming to 2 degrees. Pretty sobering. I mention these figures to highlight how quickly the climate situation is changing and the need for a plan. The imperative has shifted from 2050 to achieving major reductions before 2030, a message that was demanded at the COP26 conference in Glasgow this November, with dire consequences if this is not achieved. I should say at this point there is more bad news in the pipeline that will almost certainly shorten this deadline, some of which David Caroli discussed after the forum last year. The purpose of today's forum will be to examine ways in which this deadline and intermediate milestones can be achieved. We're under no illusion about the scale and complexity of the challenge and its implications. Whilst our principal focus will be on transport, the issues that need to be addressed are systemic and extend beyond transport. We believe this issue demands serious discussion, but anticipate thinking based on business as usual will not provide the outcomes we need. It will require very different approaches to the ones that have been adopted in the past, and this will be very challenging. Our forums have generated many papers which have been published in journals and posted on our website. Findings and recommendations have also been forwarded as ministerial submissions to government. Both will be the main objectives of this forum. We have designed this forum as a mini-conference rather than a public forum. After the speakers have given their presentations, I will introduce our panel, then open up for discussion, first amongst panel members, and then invite questions from our audience. And as Nick was saying, I think we can look forward to some pretty vibrant discussion. I now invite Vicky, to say a few words.
Thanks, Roger. Oh, that doesn't work. So Vicky, Nikki, doesn't matter. I'm just here representing the government, so names don't matter. So firstly, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, the traditional owners on the land of where we meet today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. Ben does send his apologies. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to get here, but he does consider it important that we listen, and I know that that's primarily my purpose of being here. So I won't speak for too long, and I know that much of what I say you will have, well, I hope at least, have heard much of before. So I'll be very brief because I am here just to listen. So thank you firstly for what you do. Thank you for the energy that you put in. Thank you for the research, the conversations, the work that you're doing even today, and the energy with which you come to government with how you would like to see change and how positive you are about that and the change that you want to see happen. So I want to touch on some of our key commitments and investment in reducing emissions. So we're from encouraging the transition to zero emission vehicles to supporting active transport, which is something I myself am quite passionate about, and making public transport even more efficient and seamless. So in pursuit of strong sustainable growth, the government has this year outlined an ambitious emissions reduction targets along the way to achieving net zero emission, the climate resilient Victoria by 2050. And I take on board what you're saying about not being, we've got to do it sooner than 2050, but we've got to keep making these steps. That includes a target to reduce the state's greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels by 25 to 33% by 2025. There is a clear recognition that the transport sector's contributions to emission is growing, and you've all seen that, when instead it really needs to be a part of the solution. And we do have to be nimble about what those solutions look like. Many of those emissions are generated by private travel. That is why a core part of our strategy is moving our vehicle fleet away from fossil fuels. We have announced a $46 million investment subsidy program to reduce the upfront cost of zero-emission vehicles. An additional $19 million will be for charging stations, and I'm glad to see that the federal government is also wanting to invest in this infrastructure. $10 million will commence the transition of the government fleet, and $5 million to incentivise transition in the commercial sector. Our strategy is also about encouraging Victorians to use public transport and active transport modes instead of their private vehicle. The Transport Sector Pledge includes 25% mod share target for active transport. To this end, government is building infrastructure to support public transport service uplifts. Sorry, no, it's all good. Okay, thank you. And active transport such as high-capacity signalling, line duplications, and the over 250 kilometres of cycling and walking paths across our state and city. These are currently underway. And we're putting more services than ever on our train timetable. We've had more services added to our train timetable network than since when the City Loop was put in. So we've had about 450 additional services a week added in. $400 million has been invested in bus services since 2015, and we're innovating our service delivery to ensure that public transport is an attractive option. For example, with rideshare, which lets you know where crowding is on trains, and rapid running trains trials in buses. COVID, we know, has had a significant impact on Victorian travel preferences, and someone mentioned before about the traffic in Eltham at the moment where we've got roadworks. But we have seen in the last few weeks, people are back, and they are not as comfortable using public transport as they once were. And there is definitely more work that we need to do to help people feel safe using our public transport network. And so along with the cleaning that we're doing, we also need, and as well as offering additional services to help spread out the amount of people who are on our services, we do need to do a stronger campaign around encouraging people to get back onto our PT and have them feel safe. Know that with mask wearing and other safety measures, they will be okay. But that is going to take time. There is, as you would all know, there is anxiety in our community, and that will take some time before that is alleviated. Our new active transport infrastructure has supported the mode shift, and we have continued to take steps to ensure that passengers can confidently return to public transport when they feel ready. Throughout the pandemic, we have increased the number of services, either peak times or key train lines and the CBD tram network. Our data collection and analysis also keeps us up to date with what is happening on the ground as Melburnians move around. We are also taking steps to reduce the carbon footprint of our public transport modes. We have committed to only purchase zero-emission buses from 2025 and have invested $25 million in a trial commencing from next year to help inform that transition. And we recently signed the Metropolitan Bus franchise contract with Kinetic, which will see 36 zero-emission buses on our network by 2025. More than half of Melbourne's bus fleet will be replaced with low or zero-emission vehicles over the life of their contract. This not only fast-tracks our transition, but it is a significant boost to the transport equipment manufacturing and automotive electricity supply net sections. We have also committed to power our train system with renewable energy, just as we've done with our tram network since 2018. And we are using our investment in rolling stock to introduce new technologies that reduce our power use. Our next generation tram is a really good example of how we're doing this. Technologies like more efficient propulsion systems, regenerative braking and onboard batteries are all exciting new features that I look forward to seeing on our trams. And I know, and Roger, you've commented about this in the past, that technologies are not the whole part of our solution. We can't just rely on them, but they are a part of what we can do, and particularly around our infrastructure and how it works. So we are moving forward. We are creating a number of new policies within our government to address climate change, to reduce our zero emissions. And I know that you have got a lot of ideas. I know that you've got a lot of energy to tell us how we can be doing things better. And I'm here to listen to you for as long as I can, and can look forward to hearing what people have got to say today. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. Before I introduce my first speaker, it's worth reflecting on the nature of this challenge. The environmental imperative is a given. We have to reduce emissions, but we also are constrained by the finite nature of the planet we live on and the need to restore the damage caused to the biosphere and limits to growth. I won't talk about the biosphere today, but limits to growth is a real issue, which is demonstrated with the following slides. Now, the first one shows the global footprint of the human enterprise on planet Earth. It increased from half a planet Earth in 1960 to more than 1.25 planet Earths by 2000. There's going to be a lot more now. Clearly, humanity is living beyond its means and doing so by mining the planet's natural resources. But that's only an average. The second diagram shows how it is only the poorest countries that are living within the means of planet Earth. Advanced countries require many planet Earths to maintain their lifestyle. The US requires about 5, and Australia is not far behind. Now, this thinking is reflected in limits to growth projections made in the first report to the Club of Rome in 1972. Based on the standard run, or business as usual, the global population would peak before 2050. That's probably a bit over 25 years ago in advance, and rapidly decline to less than a third within about 50 years. Less than a third. According to the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany, that figure could be much less, and the peak may occur earlier. You don't need to be a Rhodes Scholar where that's all going to end up. Now, that's not the end of the story, because limits to growth projections do not include the impact of climate change. The projections of which are shown in the fourth diagram, which I've given you there. This was one that was presented by Will Steffen in my first forum in 2009 that the graph hasn't changed, the diagram hasn't changed, and make the planet increasingly less hospitable and support fewer people. The global population by the end of the century under this scenario could easily be reduced to 0. So ultimately we're talking about negative growth and the need to consume less of the planet's resources, not more, for all activities, and that includes transport. In the transport context, this means less travel and transport less often, less frequently, over shorter distances and more efficiently. Responding to this challenge will require a very different mindset to the one that exists today. That's a real reality check. The second point I would like to make is we need to understand transport as a system so we can unpack it to find leverage points that can be used to change it in a way that enables us to meet our environmental targets. Transport, it's not just about buses and trams and vehicles and infrastructure. It's a service industry, a derived demand. In the inner city context, it's a function of the broader economy, primarily local but also national and global, the characteristics of the city itself, and the social, economic and political environment in which it operates. All of these can change, and all provide levers that can be used to meet environmental targets, and we'll talk about this later in the forum. That is the challenge. Now, I'll now introduce our first speaker, John Stanley, who will tell us how to get started. But just before John arrives, I'll introduce him. The need to achieve early emission reductions was the subject of a research paper, Reducing Australian Motor Vehicle Greenhouse Emissions, in 2017, prepared by John in collaboration with Richard Ellison, Chris Loader and David Henscher, which concluded that the Australian 2030 target should be a reduction of between 40 and 60% for road transport based on 2005 levels, not 26 to 28%, which is the federal government's current target. John Stanley is an economist and adjunct professor at the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies, the University of Sydney's Business School. He previously spent 9 years as Executive Director of Bus Association Victoria, after 8 years as Deputy Chair of the National Road Transport Commission. John was a member of the Ministerial Advisory Committee for Plan Melbourne and Plan Melbourne 2017 to 2050. He has published widely on transport policy and planning matters and was awarded a Centenary Medal for services to public transport and conservation. Please welcome John. Yep.
Thanks, Roger, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Minister, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. The presentation that I'm going to give today takes a pretty broad approach to our topic because, as Roger said, transport greenhouse gas emissions are very much dependent on the way we choose to live our lives and the way we structure our places to enable us to do that. And so if you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the best way is to look at both at how we move, but also the factors that are causing that movement and driving that movement. And a lot of the stuff we did in Plan Melbourne was intended to do that. Unfortunately, the delivery hasn't been perhaps as good as it could have been. The Ros Hansen, who I worked with on Plan Melbourne, while we were doing the process, we thought we should write down what we were doing because we were both getting on a bit. We thought we'll probably forget it pretty quickly. So we produced a book called How Great Cities Happen. And it was really looking at how strategic land use transport planning has been evolving and how we thought it should evolve for more sustainable cities and regions. And you'll see there that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is one of the critical objectives that most strategic land use transport plans set. If you look around the world, they commonly have the triple bottom line stuff of economic, social and environmental. But I put it to you in the context of what Roger was just saying, that we've got to the point now where greenhouse gas emissions ought to be a binding constraint on what we do in our land use transport plans. In other words, if we can't deliver those sorts of emission reduction targets that we're going to be talking about this afternoon, they should be driving everything else. You've got to meet that because it's really an existential crisis we're facing. So we're going to talk about what sorts of things we might be able to do. I'm going to focus on the next 10 years or so. So I know Tony's going to talk a bit longer than that. And Peter will then leave you miserable the way Roger has started off with making you feel.
We need a bit of misery.
Yeah, that's right. So I guess I'm the straight man. Okay. So this just gives you a little bit of information about Australia's road transport greenhouse gas emissions. In round terms, they're about 100 million tonnes. They account for about 18% of national greenhouse gas emissions. COVID was probably one of the best things could have happened to transport greenhouse gas emissions. It knocked them down by about 7 or 8 million tonnes. If you do a business as usual projection, you would expect them to be about 110 million tonnes by 2030. The federal government put out a report recently that suggested 100 million would be their projection of where we're going to get to. Well, good luck, you know. So we'll talk in the next 15 minutes or so about how we can make a substantial reduction in those emissions with road transport. The road transport emissions are shown here. They account for about 5 of every 6 of our national transport emissions, so around about 85 million tonnes at the moment. Unfortunately, they're growing. So not only are our national transport emissions growing, road transport, because it's the biggest bit, it's growing as well. And it's growing for a couple of reasons. Vehicle kilometres of travel are increasing, and I'll take you through that, but also we're not getting the improvements in the, if you like, the efficiency that we need to be getting out of our fuels and in terms of the way they generate greenhouse gas emissions relative to the travel we're undertaking. So, and in particular, it's the growth in light commercial vehicles, which you'll see in the next slide, has been really strong, and their fuel economy's been going backwards. So look at this is 2012 to 2020, but if you ignore the fifth of those columns in each of those charts, which is COVID 2020, it's every 2 years from 2012, 14, 16, 18. Now, over that period, passenger vehicle kilometres of travel increased just over 7%. Articulated pretty similar. The ones that really grew strongly, the red is bad, okay? Light commercial vehicles grew 19.7%. That's about 3% per annum. That is really fast growth. Really fast growth. Interestingly, population grew over that period at 8.7%. So one of the things we do need to think about a little bit is what's the kind of connection here between our rate of population growth and our level of greenhouse gas emissions. I don't know whether any of you listen to Radio National, but there was an interesting presentation yesterday morning by the Guardian's environment reporter who talked about some of the far right in the US now talking about cutting population growth because they want to protect the fossil fuel industry. So if you try and get greenhouse gas emissions, if you want to get greenhouse gas emissions down, you know, get into the population. I'm not making that as a proposition. I'm simply saying that we need to think about the fact that per capita emissions didn't actually change much. The bottom bit in green's always good in my slides, okay? If you look at Vancouver and Freiburg, 2 cities we talk about in our book, both of those cities have set a target of no increase in vehicle kilometres of travel. That's a really bold target, and I suggest that's the sort of target our governments here should be setting as well. Unfortunately, fuel economy is not getting any better. If you look at the fuel economy rate of a given sort of vehicle, you'll see it looks like it's improving, but unfortunately we've been moving into the SUVs. And the fuel economy of those is not as good as if we'd stayed in the smaller vehicles. Pretty simple story, really. If you look at the left-hand side, that's all vehicles. Passenger vehicles is the second one along, that's pretty flat. Yes, light commercial vehicles is the next one. You see the fuel economy is getting worse. So if your vehicle kilometres are going up, your fuel economy is getting worse, you're in trouble in terms of your greenhouse gas emissions. So a hypothetical, what would we have to do to cut our transport greenhouse gas emissions, or our road transport greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030? That basically means against that 110 million tonne a scenario, if you like, that I outlined, trying to knock 50 million tonnes off road transport greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So what might that look like? I'll tell you when I've had a mouthful of water. The paper that Roger talked about that we wrote in about 2016 looked at exactly this, how you could cut 50 million tonnes out of our emissions by 2030. Only then we had 14 years to do it. Now we've got 8. Quick as a flash, nothing happened. So basically we're not making any progress at all. We're spinning the wheels in this space. So if we don't get off our backsides fairly quickly, we have no hope in the world. So here are the sorts of things we need to do, and I've split them into 2 types of measures. Firstly, behaviour change measures, and second, technological change. And I'm suggesting that if you were going to try and cut, these are the emissions from cars I'm showing here, if you're trying to cut emissions from road transport by 50 million tonnes, you'd probably be wanting to try and get about 20 million tonnes of that out of behaviour change and about 30 million tonnes of that out of changing technology. So what are the sorts of things we can do in terms of behaviour change? Well, these things are additive. They add on as you go through. The first one is personal travel demand reduction. In other words, reducing the amount of movement around we do. Now, I've done a lot of work on the link between mobility and social inclusion, and trips equal inclusion. So if we're going to try and reduce the amount that people move around, we've got to reduce the amount they have to move to accomplish a given activity rather than keep them at home all day, which wasn't much fun in COVID, was it? So it's really about trying to shorten trips rather than obliterate them. And shortening trips is about land use, about arranging your activities so people live closer to where the sort of stuff they want to do takes place. The second one is about increasing the active transport mode share, and we've suggested about a 15 percentage points increase, which is a big increase, and it's good to hear that the government's thinking about what it can do to assist in that space. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The third one is to increase the urban public transport mode share to 20%. Now, many of you will remember Steve Brack. Steve, in a moment of, I thought, great insight, Treasury thought madness, talked about trying to get 20% of our trips made on public transport by 2020. A really good target. I think as soon as he made that, Treasury shut him up. But that's where we should be going now. We should be really trying to get 20% of all our public transport trips in this city, for example, in Sydney, Brisbane, on public transport in that time, by 2030. Increasing vehicle occupancy. It's a really simple way to cut emissions. Double the number of people in your car. We're going the other way. We're getting less. Fewer people in our car. The last one I've talked about is improving freight efficiency, and there's lots of technologies around to help you do that. Then we'll move on now to vehicle technologies, and I'm not going to talk much about that because I know that Tony's going to talk about that a bit in his presentation, but the National Transport Commission that I was involved in a previous incarnation puts out a good annual report where it looks at our carbon emissions from the road transport and compares us to Europe and elsewhere. And if you just look at some of those comparisons in those slides, basically the emissions that we've got compared to Europe, they're vastly different. Our averages are shown in the left-hand stack there for cars, which is the green one, and the aquamarine, I suppose it is one, is light commercial vehicles. If you look at the middle bars, they're the European 2020 standards. So we're averaging about 150 grams a kilometre. The European 2020 standard for new vehicles is 95. If you look at light commercial vehicles, we're way over 200. The European standard is 147. So, we're kind of living in yesterday a bit, and you wonder why this is. What on earth are we trying to protect? We don't make any cars. We don't make any trucks. So why on earth do we continue sticking with out-of-date emission standards? So this just basically summarises the standards that the Europeans have got. I will make the point that in terms of heavy vehicles, I know there are technologies about now that are being trialled, being passed through tests in the US that will enable you to cut your greenhouse gas emissions by about 25 or 30% overnight. So really, there's an opportunity there to do something as a pathway as we move towards new technologies in that space. It's an aftermarket technology, so I don't know whether the original equipment manufacturers will cause mayhem there and void warranties, but that's the sort of stuff we can do to actually get quite quick changes of some magnitude. And Minister, it's great to see the Victorian Government's initiative with buses in terms of the heavy vehicles. If you want one single thing to do to stimulate the sort of behaviour change I've talked about, to shorten trips, to encourage walking and cycling, to get people out of cars into buses or active transport, it's road pricing reform. And I have to say that I did my honours thesis at Melbourne University in 1968 on congestion pricing. So, nobody's listening. This message has been around for a long time. Infrastructure Victoria have come out again in the last week or so, arguing in favour of pricing. My colleague David Hench and I said, well, look, let's do a little exercise, put a price on the external costs of car use, and let's use fuel, just because we've got fuel taxes, to try and recover those. Get rid of fuel excise, get rid of the registration charges, put a charge on fuel to recover the lot. What you would have to have done when we did this about 3 or 4 years ago was increase the fuel excise by 25 cents a litre. It was about 40 cents a litre at the time. It needed to go up by about 25 cents a litre if you were going to recover all the costs that road users, in their magnanimity, impose on the rest of us. By what right? On what basis can people expect to impose those sorts of costs on the wider community? It's time we did something about it. So we had a little exercise where we looked, and it's some modelling on Sydney that I did with some colleagues there, at a package of measures that might enable us to shift behaviour change. Look at the bottom one there. That involves a 25% increase in fuel tax. Now, a 25% increase in fuel tax was around about what I talked about before, that you need to internalise those external costs. But as well as that, we looked at reducing public transport fares, increasing speed of services and increasing frequency. Now, if you did all those things the way we've got it there, we estimated in Sydney you would have reduced car VKT by over 30%. So in other words, if you put a package of measures in place, you can do these things quite quickly if you have the political courage. I talked before about land use being fundamental. This is what determines our trip lengths as much as anything else. The bits in green are the core elements, if you like, if you want to try and develop a more compact city, and a more compact city is the basis for a more sustainable city. You need a strong core. That's where you get, that's the CBD and its surrounds. They drive your agglomeration economies, and some work that Peter did with me back on Plan Melbourne. You need to develop these middle urban knowledge clusters, which Plan Melbourne included, based on the work that we did in that process. You need also to have strong strategic trunk public transport corridors where you are prepared to run higher densities. We do not do that. If you look at cities like Vancouver and London, they do that really well. We are missing out badly there in not designating strategic trunk corridors where we're prepared to go a lot higher in density. 20-minute neighbourhoods. One of the really innovative ideas in Plan Melbourne that's been picked up by places like Singapore. Unfortunately, we've done bugger all to actually implement it. Lots of demonstration studies. Well, that's not good enough. If you want to get your trip lengths down, you've actually got to start investing in delivering 20-minute neighbourhoods rather than talking about it. So there's a real opportunity there, but we've got to get off our backsides and do something about it. Okay, so just in conclusion, road transport is a large and growing source of greenhouse gas emissions. But with really serious concerted efforts, we could potentially go close, I think, to cutting 50 million tonne out of our emissions by 2030. But to do that, we're going to have to do some really serious things that at the moment do not look like happening. We need mandatory emission standards. That's really fundamental on the technology side. Neither of the main parties is remotely interested in that in Canberra. We need to reform the way we price our road use. Neither the national government or federal governments nor state governments are interested in that. So if you get those two out of court, think about the benefit of repricing reform. It is a significant revenue generator. It will let you pay for the sorts of things you need to do to drive the behaviour change. If we don't do those two things, then we can give away any prospect of getting 50 million tonnes out of our road transport emissions by 2030. And the slide, the talk's available for you to look at if you want to. I won't take it any further there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. As I said, you had the easy bit. The challenge now is to get to zero. Much tougher challenge. The goalposts have shifted. They're not my team anyway. We have been looking at 2030 or 2035 at the latest, not 2050. I'll repeat that again because it's so important. Now, this is a subject Tony Wood, our next speaker, has spent much time researching. Tony has been Director of the Energy Program since 2011 after 14 years working at Origin Energy in senior executive roles. From 2009 to 14, he was also Program Director of Clean Energy projects at the Clinton Foundation, advising governments in the Asia-Pacific region on effective deployment of large-scale, low-emission energy technologies. In 2008, he was seconded to provide an industry perspective to the first Ghana Climate Change Review. In January 2018, Tony was awarded a Member of the Order of Australia in recognition of his significant service to conservation and the environment, particularly in the areas of energy, policy, climate change and sustainability. In October 2019, Tony was elected as a Fellow to the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. Please welcome Tony.
Thank you, Roger, and thanks for the opportunity this afternoon. I will confess that I've not changed my behaviour, John. But I did drive my electric vehicle here, so no. But of course, living in Victoria, that means it wasn't the zero emissions trip. I just want to stick some of these things together a little bit in the context of, I suspect, what Chris Bowen may have been talking about as we're here, because he's talking at the National Press Club today about Labor's commitments to net zero by 2050. And my only observation would, two things I'd make about where we're now at federally. One is that both parties are now committed to net zero by 2050. Labor has emphasised 2030 as the focus that we have to get moving if we're going to achieve anything like net zero by 2050, whereas the Coalition has focused on the technologies we'll need in the 2030s and 2040s to get us to 2050. The sad news, of course, is that we need both. And neither party seem yet to really engage with that. The even sadder news is both of them used economic modelling to try and prove that their case is sound, and both of those, in my view, would be the worst and the second worst piece of economic modelling I've ever seen in public policy. It's a very sad reflection of the day when we make policy decisions based upon the outputs of economic models that produce results which are the interests of the people who asked for the modelling to be done in the first place. So that's I'll get that off my chest and now talk about the main topic. Okay, so look, first thing is that you all know this, that we've now got an interesting situation where Australia effectively has been committed to net zero by 2050 for a while, and the Commonwealth governments now recognise that. Many of our countries to whom we export things like coal and oil and gas are also committed to net zero by 2050, and some of them have got stronger targets. That will decide the future of our coal industry and the future of our gas industry, not what the Australian government would like to think it can do, and that's a big deal. It's a big deal, particularly politically, because it affects jobs in carbon-intensive areas of Australia, and at the 2019 election you saw how that played out, and that's why Albanese has been saying what he's been saying in relation to this. The other thing that's happened is the world is starting to move even faster, and we will see over the next little while, probably certainly within the term of this next federal government, a change towards what are called carbon border adjustment mechanisms. I love the acronym CBAMs. It sort of sounds like some exotic animal to me, but What it means is that we may, for the first time, beginning to see global trade in emissions reduction, and that may be an efficient thing. It will also definitely impact on our exports, and even our farmers know that. The other thing is that we have now committed to a number of things at COP26, not all of them. Some of them were controversial in terms of what Australia chose to do, but we have made some serious commitments, and we are also obliged to go back at the end of next year with our further commitments, and that's going. The Labor Party's made it very clear where they're intending to go. This one proves I can make complicated charts. Basically what this is trying to show is that we talk about net zero by 2050 or X% by 2030, but behind all that is what's called a carbon budget, because the environment doesn't really care how much emissions we put into the atmosphere on the 1st of January 2030 or 2050. What the environment cares about is how much we put in there between now and then. And our actual target isn't 26% by 2030, it's actually an accumulated amount of emissions that we put into the atmosphere between 2021 and 2030. And that's why the point that John made is important, because those emissions that we avoided as a result of COVID count towards our target, which is one of the reasons why we're looking a bit better at achieving our target. Now, all we have to do is have a pandemic every year for the next 30 years and we'll be fine. The problem is most of us would probably not wish that upon any of us. So the numbers become tricky, and the way the numbers are presented to us are often misleading, because they're presented in a way that suits the message of the people who are making these statements. The point about this is that even if the top line is basically what the government's projections show, that is, the top of the chart shows we're going to be at about 440 million tonnes a year by 2030. That's the current projection. That's where the government says 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. If we were to follow that line as a straight line down to 2050, we'd actually be over budget. We'd expend our budget by 2033, the carbon budget, which would be necessary for Australia to do its fair share of meeting net zero globally by 2050. We'd be pinching somebody else's budget, basically. That's a challenge. And you can see that orange bit shows that, well, if we did go faster from about now to, say, about 2035, then we might be able to do it. But it would be a steep curve. So when you hear governments or politicians talking about these targets, try and remember what they're not talking about is this issue of this carbon budget, because it is harder than the point target. Now, this chart is an attempt, very quickly, just want to put transport into perspective. So the left-hand chart, in each of these charts, there's 9 of them. Each of them shows where we were in 2005, which is the base year, where we are now, and the red dots on the right are where we're predicted to be in 2030, and you can see that electricity is the one that's doing all the heavy lifting, basically. All that comes from renewable energy, and most of that comes from rooftop solar. This is not due to the actions of the federal government, despite what the government likes to say, and none of what they're doing is contributing to what those emissions will be in 2030. Most of it is being driven by state government policies. I guess what's disturbing in a way is that transport, and this is consistent I think with what John was saying, transport's predicted to go up further for the reasons he mentioned. Other sectors like stationary energy and industrial activity are all projected to be either flat or increasing, and that's a real problem. Agriculture isn't going to do very much, because unless you're going to do something about putting little gas masks on cows, there's a real problem with agriculture, because most of the emissions come from burping cows and sheep. And so the issue here is that whilst electricity is important, it's about a third of our emissions, it's going down. Nothing else is going down, and by the time we get to 2030, electricity will well and truly be on the way towards net zero by 2050, but nothing else will be. And that obviously is a problem, and the transport's included in that. So what we did is this year we wrote a series of 5 reports. These are the covers of those reports that are on our website, and we looked at each of the individual sectors: transport, industrial emissions, agriculture. We wrote a report on offsetting, because government and Labor are both depending upon offsetting emissions to get to net zero. Now, the word net zero rolls off the tongue relatively easily, but it is seriously important, because net zero does not mean we're at zero emissions. What it means is that by 2050, every single tonne of greenhouse gas that goes into the atmosphere has to be offset by a tonne that's taken out of the atmosphere. You can't do that by reducing emissions. You can only do it by taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And as far as I know, there's only 3 ways to do it. One is planting trees, and those trees better stay there for a long time, or be regrown and regrown and regrown forever. The second one is soil carbon, and that's very difficult to measure and to prove and to actually do. And the third is what's called direct air capture, which basically a big vacuum cleaner is sucking carbon dioxide out of the air. Now, if you think any of those sounds like a great solution, then you've got rocks in your head, in my opinion. That is the answer that governments have. But when you look at the government's projections which say we're going to get to net zero by 2050, the actual numbers in their published report say we're still going to be emitting today 500 million tonnes a year, still going to be emitting about 240 million tonnes in 2050. We're just going to be offsetting all those emissions, part of it by doing things of the sort I mentioned, and part of it by paying our neighbours in the Pacific, Fiji, Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, to do things in their countries, and we'll basically pay them to do it for us, if they'd be so kind, because we don't know how to do it ourselves, basically. That doesn't seem to me like a great solution. But the numbers are hard, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. Because if we pretend otherwise, then we're going to end up in a difficult space. So what do these numbers really start to look like? Well, in vehicles, the issue is light vehicles, cars and LCVs, like commercial vehicles, are about, of the 100-odd million tonnes that John mentioned, it's expected to be up there as we recover a little bit from COVID. About 60% come from there, and another 20% come from heavy vehicles. So basically, road transport is about 80% in that sense. So the thing that I should have understood but never thought about was a trick in the numbers around vehicles. Even though the average life or average age of vehicles on the road is somewhere between about 11 years, the life expectancy of vehicles is between 15 and 20 years. That makes it's basically like most of us really, I suppose. There's a big difference in those two numbers. Now, when you think about what that means, if we want to be at net zero by 2050 for the transport sector, it's very difficult to get there unless you've got there at least with the light vehicles. But if we're still putting light vehicles with internal combustion engines on the road in 2035, they'll still be there in 2050. So either we've got to stop doing that, or we've got to start, or we're going to have to start, we're going to pay to get rid of those vehicles in the 2030s and 2040s, which is not a very good idea either. So that's why emission standard makes a big difference. That's why we have to start now. Because if we do start now with an emission standard, that would gradually reduce emissions progressively until 2035, where you'd effectively be at the point where you weren't selling any more zero-emission vehicles. We'd actually have some chance of doing that with light vehicles. That would then start to have the impact that John was talking about. I have looked at the sort of analysis that John and his team have done, and I'm aware of when I was in the committee for Melbourne. I think, John, when we first met, I think one of the problems we have in this country is that the fundamental physical nature of the design of our cities makes it really difficult to do what John's been talking about for a long time. Really, just because basically we have not shown a great propensity to do the sort of things John's talking about. We've talked about it and we've tried, some people have tried, but basically our politicians and our people are not interested. In terms of medium density housing, for example, it's really, really hard to do. Therefore, we've assumed we can't do it. Now, we may be extremely pessimistic, but the other part of the solution, therefore, as we're concerned, is to put a whole lot of effort into heavy vehicles, and that's one of the reasons why we support what the federal government's been doing to support trials, for example, on hydrogen fuel cell trucks. Now, the only problem really there is going to be getting the hydrogen to the trucks. That's probably going to mean we're going to be moving hydrogen around or manufacturing it on site. I don't think we're going to be I just genuinely don't think we're going to put hydrogen in our gas network and deliver hydrogen in the same way we do LPG, natural gas. And I don't think we'll deliver it by road transport, which is the way we deliver LPG to service stations today. But I think hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles is most likely to be the right answer, and therefore doing trials today is very important. The alternative is some form of drop-in biofuels. They're a bit harder, there are technical issues, and right now they're very expensive, but they're possible. This chart just basically tries to illustrate what I said before. Basically what it says is if the electric vehicles on the top left-hand side of this go up at the rate I've been talking about, that is the sales are going up and the sales of internal combustion vehicles is going down, then the share of vehicles, which is the bottom chart, you can see there, it starts to really have an impact. And so the EV share of the fleet is almost at 100% by 2050 if we start now and we progress that way. You might have some chance of getting there. Now, it doesn't mean that you won't be selling any vehicles. I think the biggest problem will be for many people who want to have an internal combustion engine, you won't be able to get petrol anymore. Because at some point, oil companies are just going to stop selling it because it won't be worth their effort, because there won't be any, the number of cars on the road who want to buy it will be very small. And even though I, like a lot of my friends these days, seem to believe that vinyl records is the answer, it's a lot easier to import vinyl records than it is to import your own petrol for your car, I suggest, in the future. So I think it's going to be a real challenge for the vehicles that are left. We don't talk about that very much. So we've got some of our recommendations overlap with what John was talking about. We do need to get an emission standard that can be done on a fleet basis, so that some manufacturers will produce more zero-emission vehicles and some will produce fewer. We think we should get rid of some of those inefficient taxes. The Labor Party's policy announcement on Friday suggested they're hoping that if they remove these taxes, in particular, they work it through the big one is if fringe benefit tax, that would have a big impact on reducing the increasing the number of electric vehicles on the road. I just haven't looked recently at the number of vehicles that are sold through employers that have an FBT association with them, so I'm a bit sceptical as to whether they're just hoping for something. Because remember, what Labor did, why did they not announce an emission standard on Friday? Because they've given up. Their view is that because we've waited so long, as John was saying, it's now so late that if we did introduce an emission standard now, because Labor is focused on 2030, it won't have much impact by 2030. It really only starts to bite in the mid to late 2030s. And they don't want to have a shit fight with the government over something that won't have a big impact on 2030, so they decided not to have a fight. Now, if they did that across the entire economy and all of our emissions, of course, they're not going to have a fight at all and there wouldn't be any policy. They are choosing to have a fight on the industrial emissions, and you'll hear more about that between now and the election, wherever that turns out to be. And of course, the government decided not to have an emission standard because they believed that they were so successful in the 2019 election of convincing people that electric vehicles would ruin the weekend that they just rejected it. And they're hoping that what will happen is EVs will become so cheap and so pervasive, people will buy them anyway and it won't need any government policy. So they're putting some money into electric vehicle charging infrastructure. There's a number of things I won't bother to go through now, but happy to talk about. There is a huge amount of effort to be done in terms of charging infrastructure. There is a real risk here that some of that infrastructure will be stranded asset. That the things people think they want now to charge their electric vehicles won't be needed in the future because most people, which I think will charge most of the time at home or at work. And that means that if you're going to put a lot of commercial charging facilities, where do you put them? And the idea that people driving to somewhere to fill up their car with electricity is, I think, very small, although charging facilities on the highway could be very important. I just want to make one other point about if you hear people talking about net zero. This is a chart that says, look, if we made some pretty bold assumptions about what could be done across the sector, including transport, with our emissions, we've got some sectors where we think you could get emissions down by about 20%, 50% and 90% at the bottom, and cars would be in that bottom sector, trucks in the middle sector. What you would find is that there would, and grazing beef at the very top, of course, for the reasons I mentioned before, you add all those up and you're about 100 million tonnes a year. So even though I was being mildly critical of the government's target of 200 odd million tonnes a year by 2050, actually getting much less than 100 million tonnes by 2050 turns out to be hard. And that means, even on what I'm talking about, we'd have to be offsetting 100 million tonnes a year by 2050. And therefore, we need to work on how we're going to offset emissions, or we need to do a lot more work about some of these sectors. So when people tell you, why don't we just set stronger targets for 2030, most of the time they're having lend of you because they've got no suggestions of how we actually do it. And how we do it, the policies we need, not the wishful thinking, is going to drive how this is going to play out. And to some extent, industry already is moving faster than government, but they won't continue to do it by themselves. And the federal government's assumption that industry will simply pay $30 a tonne is wishful thinking. So overall, I think we do need both action now to get ourselves moving on net zero by 2050, otherwise we won't get there, but we also need work on the technologies which will be important to get to 2050, and there'll be technologies that will emerge in the 2030s and 2040s. Thanks, Roger.
Thank you, Tony.